Weidner finally completed his text for the cycle by 1852, and he began composing the music shortly afterward, without any realistic prospect of the works ever being performed. Das Rheingold, which Weidner called a preliminary evening to the main drama, came first and was the nearest Weidner came to realizing the theoretical ideal laid out in his essays. The opera's cast of Norse gods, dwarves, and giants communicate with conversation-like directness, while the orchestra provides commentary. For the first day of the cycle, Die Walküre, Weidner created music of far greater sensuality and warmth, in part because this installment added humans into the tale, specifically the long-lost twins Siegmund and Sieglinde, who fall in love during the course of the first act. By 1856, however, Weidner had also discovered the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who would prove to be a powerful influence on his creative output. Not only did Schopenhauer present a philosophy of pessimism, incompatible with the revolutionary zeal that inspired The Ring, but he viewed music as the most profoundly expressive of any of the arts, turning Wagner's drama-first conviction on its head. I shall never write an opera more. As I have no wish to invent an arbitrary title for my works, I will call them dramas. Richard Wagner. The Ring was made up of 4 operas, which Wagner worked on in 2 distinct phases during his lifetime, beginning and ending with Götterdämmerung. Wagner's style was not popular with everyone, as seen in this American cartoon, which criticized the dense noise of Götterdämmerung, the last opera of the Ring cycle. Breaking the cycle. In practical terms, Wagner's discovery of Schopenhauer brought about a break in his composition of The Ring. He stopped composing Siegfried after completing a draft score of the second act in 1857. He did not return to it for 7 years. During the interim, Wagner completed 2 very different works, both of which were deeply inspired by Schopenhauer's philosophy, specifically, its idea that relative fulfillment could be achieved only through renunciation. The first of these new works was Tristan und Isolde, an overtly philosophical and sensuous work in which Wagner pushed traditional harmony to its limits. The second work, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, was a comedy of unprecedented dimensions. The final act alone is more than 2 hours long when staged, that dealt with profound issues, such as the place of art within society, art's relationship with national identity, and the balance to be struck between rule-based tradition and innovation. When Wagner finally returned to his composition of The Ring, he immediately applied the musical and philosophical lessons learned from his interim projects to the cycle, bringing an even greater harmonic richness to the third act of Siegfried and to the fourth opera, Götterdämmerung, in which The Ring is finally returned to the Rhine maidens, and Valhalla, home of the gods, collapses. Wagner completed his final installment in November 1874, 25 years after first starting work on the project. Tristan and its Chord. Tristan und Isolde first premiered in Munich in 1865, starring Ludwig Schnorr von Karelsfeld and his wife Malwina Garrigues as the doomed lovers. Inspired by his discovery of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophies and a romantic obsession with Mathilde von Wesendonck, the wife of his Swiss patron, Wagner began composing Tristan und Isolde in 1857, finishing it less than 2 years later. The work, which explores the adulterous romance and subsequent death of the legendary lovers, arguably laid the foundations for the breakdown of tonality. In it, Wagner creates a disorientating, intoxicating world built on harmonic tension that, reflecting the drama's obsession with the impossibility of perfect love, remains unresolved until the very end. Emblematic of this work is the so-called Tristan chord, the first chord in the prelude, whose apparently unrelated notes of F, B, D-sharp, and G-sharp form the basis for the work's harmonic instability. The Tristan chord, as used by Wagner, was hugely influential on composers seeking to push and break the boundaries of harmony. I laid my plans on so important a scale that it would be impossible to produce this opera at any lesser theater. Richard Wagner. Festival Theater. Upon completion of The Ring, Wagner decided that no existing theater would do to stage it and set about raising funds for a new Festspielhaus. The theater that Wagner built in the Franconian town of Bayreuth to stage The Ring in 1876 is in many ways as revolutionary as the works it was built to stage. It has a broad auditorium, with long rows of seats laid out to resemble an ancient amphitheater. The orchestra and conductor are not visible to the audience, as their pit is sunk beneath the stage. In an unprecedented step for the time, the lights in the auditorium would be extinguished during the performance, and comings and goings were forbidden. The English National Opera performs The Ride of the Valkyries at Glastonbury Festival in 2004. The well-known piece comes at the start of Act 3 of Die Walküre. Leitmotif. The leitmotif technique is related to Berlioz's idée fixe, a fixed idea or theme in a work, which he used in his Symphonie Fantastique. It is also related to other earlier forms of reminiscence motif, a recurring set of notes signifying a character or their memories. Motifs were utilized to a greater extent, and with unprecedented sophistication, in Wagner's The Ring, however, where the whole musical fabric, specifically in the orchestra, of the work was built from melodic fragments that become associated with different characters, ideas, or states of mind. From the very first performances of The Ring, attempts were made to decode these leitmotifs and to interpret the orchestral writing as a commentary on the drama. The technique went on to be widely adopted, including, in the 20th century, by film composers. Operatic pilgrimage. From the very first festival in 1876, the great and the good flocked to Bayreuth, and with Wagner's final opera, Parsifal, the unmistakable allure of the festival only grew. Things were not straightforward, however, and the unprecedented scenic demands of The Ring were only imperfectly met at its first production. One of Wagner's most vocal critics, Edward Hanslick, said that the rainbow bridge that leads to Valhalla at the end of Das Rheingold resembled a seven-colored sausage. Wagner's wife, Cosima, famously complained that the costumes, painstakingly researched, made everyone look like Native American chiefs. The dragon Wagner had ordered from Manchester, UK, for Siegfried, never arrived in full. The next section, the story goes, ended up not in Bayreuth but Beirut. A new beginning. The legacy of The Ring, Wagner's Bayreuth project, and the composer himself cannot be overestimated. Wagnerism was fashionable in Paris at the end of the 19th century as artists were inspired by the heady mix of religion and sex in Parsifal. Meanwhile, in Vienna, debate raged between those who supported Brahms and his more conventional symphonies and those who were fully under the Wagnerian spell. Leitmotif became a standard technique for a generation of younger composers, many of whom attempted, after Wagner's death, to create earnest facsimiles of his operatic works. Italy, traditionally the home of opera, had a crisis of musical identity, torn between embracing Wagner's innovations and preserving its own revered traditions. Thanks to Wagner, opera, which he once criticized for being too susceptible to frivolousness, was now an art form that dealt with the grandest philosophical questions and demanded a new revolutionary sort of music to do so. The opera house Wagner had built in Bayreuth was designed by Gottfried Semper, with continental seating that allowed all patrons an equal view of the stage. See also, The Magic Flute, The Barber of Seville, Der Freischütz, La Traviata Tosca, The Wreckers, Peter Grimes. In context. Focus. Fall and rise of the symphony before. 1824 Beethoven completes his Symphony No. 9. 1853 Robert Schumann hails Brahms as the hope of German music in an influential essay, Neue Bahnen. 1858 Brahms completes his first piano concerto, which at one point was conceived as a symphony, and his first serenade. After 1877 in a review, the conductor Hans von Bülow hails Brahms's first symphony as Beethoven's 10th. 1889 Mahler conducts the premiere of his Symphony No. 1 in Budapest, the first of his 9 completed symphonies. In the first decades of the 19th century, Beethoven took the symphony to new heights, making it the most important genre in the Austro-German tradition. In the wake of his death, a handful of composers stepped in to assume Beethoven's mantle. Among them was German composer Johannes Brahms, who deplored program music that sought to follow or describe a narrative line, and openly criticized the new German school represented by Richard Wagner and Franz Liszt. Brahms believed in producing pure music, which was abstract, rather than associated with a plot line. In 1853, Brahms met Robert Schumann and his pianist wife, Clara. Schumann, who was the composer of 4 symphonies, hailed Brahms as the great hope of German music, describing the 20-year-old composer as a man of destiny, placing on Brahms the weight of public expectation. Brahms and Adele Strauss, wife of Johann Strauss II, sit down to breakfast in his villa in the summer of 1894. Brahms often visited their villa in Bad Ischl, Austria. Johannes Brahms. The son of a struggling musician, Brahms was born in Hamburg, northern Germany, in 1833. He received his first music lessons from his father, and as a teenager he helped support his family by playing piano in the inns of Hamburg, before finding work as a choral conductor. In 1863, Brahms settled in Vienna, marking the start of a highly successful period in which he composed a German requiem, the First Symphony, and his Hungarian dances. In the years following Robert Schumann's death in 1856, Brahms became particularly close to his widow, Clara, and would be a friend of hers for life. In later life, Brahms focused on instrumental music, but in 1896, the year before his death, he wrote Wir Ernst Gesang, reflecting on the transience of life. Other key works: 1853 Piano Sonata No. 3 in F minor, Op. 5. 1868 A German Requiem. 1869 Hungarian Dances. First Symphony. Brahms started sketching his first symphonies soon after Schumann's endorsement but did not complete it until the mid-1870s, more than 20 years later. In the interim, Brahms tried his hand at other symphonies, but none reached fruition. Meanwhile, he composed many orchestral and chamber works, including sonatas for violin, cello, and piano. He destroyed the works he was unhappy with, but parts of his attempts at symphonic writing were recast in other pieces, such as the opening of his first piano concerto. The intensely self-critical composer published his first string quartets, another Beethovenian genre par excellence, only in 1873, and they, as well as 2 other important works rooted in different traditions, arguably paved the way for the symphonic breakthrough. In a German requiem, Brahms set Lutheran texts in a manner that looked back to the earliest German choral music, while his so-called Haydn variations explored an array of compositional devices old and new in an orchestral context. This synthesis of tradition and innovation distinguished the First Symphony, whose themes fuse folk song and chorale, as well as allusions to Bach and to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Brahms's First Symphony, like Beethoven's Ninth, moves from darkness to light, with a stormy opening from bass and timpani that subsides into a dreamy andante before bringing in urgent pizzicato strings. The third movement, the Allegretto, captures a joyful atmosphere while at the same time showcasing Brahms's close attention to symmetry. Someone destined to give ideal presentment to the highest expression of the times. Robert Schumann. Further works. Following the success of his First Symphony, Brahms composed 3 more, choosing to conclude his Fourth Symphony with a thrilling Passacaglia, a Baroque form that develops its material over a constantly repeating bass line. Brahms's symphonies may seem conservative in comparison to those who succeeded him, such as Gustav Mahler, whose First Symphony heralded a new direction when it burst onto the scene in 1889, but Brahms's development of earlier forms and processes would prove influential for a whole generation of modernists. See also, Mozart's Symphony No. 40, Eroica Symphony, Symphonie Fantastique, Schumann Symphony No. 1, Faust Symphony, Dvorak's Symphony No. 9. In context. Focus ballet music before 1832 La Sylphide, the first romantic ballet, opens in Paris, choreographed by Filippo Taglioni to music composed by Jean-Madeleine Schnitzhofer. 1870 Leo Delibes' ballet Coppelia, about a dancing doll that comes to life, is staged at the Paris Opera. 1876 Delibes' ballet Sylvia opens in Paris. Tchaikovsky praises his score for Sylvia above Wagner's Ring Cycle. After 1911 Stravinsky's ballet Petrushka premieres in Paris. 1920 the Paris Opera stages the premiere of Stravinsky's Pulcinella, with choreography by Leonid Massine. The libretto is inspired by a folk tale. The 19th century brought a revolution in the world of ballet. Earlier ballet music had been largely made up of well-known opera songs linked by melodies written by a theater musician. Few original scores for ballet were composed before 1820. At this time, light romantic ballets began to appear, dominated in Europe by dancers such as Marie Taglioni, whose father Filippo choreographed La Sylphide to showcase her skills. Its central themes of enchantment and an ethereal female lead were a vehicle for dancers to explore floating motion and point work, with ever shorter dresses to allow the dancers' feet and legs to be seen. The music for these earlier ballets was very much at the service of the dance, and usually written by specialists, composers prepared to produce light, rhythmic music that would not upstage the dance. The heart of the classical repertory is the Tchaikovsky, Petipa Sleeping Beauty, and no ballet is harder to get right. Robert Gottlieb, American writer and dance critic. Ballet moves east. From about 1850, ballet's center began to shift from Paris to Russia, where Tsarist patronage facilitated lavish productions. Tchaikovsky received the commission for his first ballet, Swan Lake, in 1875. Approaching the commission with symphonic ambition, he created melodies associated with characters in the story. The critics, however, were not ready for a ballet score worthy of the concert hall, and in spite of a warm audience reception, critical incomprehension saw the work shelved. While the choreographer on Swan Lake, Julius Reisinger, had allowed Tchaikovsky quite a lot of freedom, the choreographer Marius Petipa was more specific about what he required of the music when he collaborated with Tchaikovsky on Sleeping Beauty. The work was well received by the critics, and the two men joined forces again for the Nutcracker 2 years later, although illness compelled Petipa to delegate much of the work to his assistant Lev Ivanov. Fairy tale ending. Composition of the Nutcracker had a difficult start. Tchaikovsky felt constrained by the unimaginative libretto Petipa had created from Alexander Dumas's adaptation of German author E.T.A. Hoffmann's darker tale. The composer finally found inspiration in the death of his sister, his childhood playmate. He poured his memories of her into the music, particularly into the central character, the young girl Clara, who creeps down on Christmas Eve to play with her favorite gift, a nutcracker figure, which magically comes to life. After she helps it to defeat a vicious mouse king, the nutcracker turns into a prince, who takes her to the land of sweets, ruled by the sugar plum fairy. The charm of Tchaikovsky's score is in large part due to his creative use of the orchestra, from the sinuous woodwind of the Arabian dance and the trilling flutes and piccolos contrast with the low bassoons in the Chinese dance, to the novelty of the celesta, a newly invented keyboard instrument with bars like a glockenspiel. To introduce the sugar plum fairy. While the music gave Petipa and his dancers the lead they required, Tchaikovsky's unique sonority raises the music far above the old music of the specialists. Columbine and Harlequin evoke the Nutcracker's fantasy world in costumes designed by Denmark's Queen Margrethe II for a production in Copenhagen in 2016. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Born in Votkinsk, Russia, in 1840, Tchaikovsky received piano lessons from an early age. He enrolled at the newly opened St. Petersburg Conservatory in 1861 and wrote his first symphony in 1866. His Romeo and Juliet overture was his first international success. Despite recognizing his own homosexuality, Tchaikovsky entered a doomed marriage in 1877. A year earlier, the wealthy widow and arts lover Nadezhda von Meck had become his patroness, enabling him to devote his time to composing. Von Meck declared herself bankrupt in 1890, causing a rift with Tchaikovsky. The fatalism that often tinged his music is clearly present in last works, such as his Sixth Symphony. He died 9 days after its premiere. Other key works: 1876, Swan Lake; 1878, Eugene Onegin; 1889, Sleeping Beauty; 1893, Symphony No. 6. See also, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, The Magic Flute, Le Sacre du Printemps, Romeo and Juliet, Appalachian Spring. In context. Focus. From Romanticism to Modernism before. 1849, Franz Liszt completes his first tone poem, Ce qu'on en sur la montagne, after the poem by Victor Hugo. 1865, Richard Strauss's father, Franz, plays the horn in the premiere of Wagner's Tristan und Isolde in Munich. After 1903, Gustav Mahler conducts the first full performance of his 100-minute Third Symphony, which he completed in 1896. 1917, the premiere is held of Alexander von Zemlinsky's A Florentine Tragedy, an opera based, like Strauss's Salome, on a work by Oscar Wilde. The period after Richard Wagner's death in 1883 was a time of uncertainty for German music. Some composers sought to emulate Wagner in their own operas, others avoided opera altogether and applied Wagner's innovations to music composed for the concert hall. Anton Bruckner, for example, brought Wagnerian grandeur, dimensions, and harmonic adventurousness to the traditional symphonic form. Gustav Mahler expanded the form even further, employing an orchestra of unprecedented size and symphonies that incorporated programmatic elements and vocal parts. The prophet Zarathustra's writings about Ahura Mazda form the basis of the Zoroastrian faith. This portrait of him hangs at a fire temple in Yazd, Iran. New forms. Richard Strauss, Mahler's great contemporary, took a different route with the tone poem, a musical form that seeks to capture the story or atmosphere of a non-musical work, such as a poem or painting. The genre was pioneered by Franz Liszt and formed the basis for Strauss's early reputation as a firebrand. Strauss's breakthrough was the daringly erotic Don Juan, and in the next decade he produced a series of works that combined his virtuosity as an orchestrator with formal innovation, eschewing, for example, the need for a piece to end in the key it begins in. Controversial at the time, Strauss's works were not written to be edifying or morally empowering, as demanded by 19th-century musical aesthetics. This aligned him with other modernist composers, whose defining feature was their emphasis on innovation and progress, redefining composition by challenging formal conventions. I would only believe in a God that knows how to dance. Friedrich Nietzsche. Also sprach Zarathustra. Role of the artist. Also sprach Zarathustra was arguably Strauss's boldest tone poem. The 35-minute work took its title from the book by Friedrich Nietzsche, in which the philosopher used the character of the ancient Persian prophet to present his philosophy. In Strauss's own words, he set out to convey in music an idea of the evolution of the human race from its origin through the various phases of development, up to Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch through his tone poem. This idea of the Übermensch, a figure unburdened by conventional morality or religion, resonated well with Strauss's own vision of the role of the independent artist at the dawn of the 20th century. It also helped to pave the way for his brand of amoral modernism, epitomized in his scandalous breakthrough opera Salome, based on a play by Oscar Wilde that featured incest, necrophilia, and blasphemy. Age of Uncertainty. Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra depicts a conflict between nature, which is represented by the trumpet's simple opening CGC motif, and humanity, whose complex passions and intellectual struggles are conveyed by more harmonically adventurous writing. The tone poem includes 9 sections, named from Nietzsche's book, with music that includes a mocking fugue and a light-hearted waltz. Man and nature remain unreconciled at the work's daring conclusion, which vacillates uncertainly between the keys of C major and B major. Also sprach Zarathustra was completed in 1896. This frontispiece from that year, printed in Munich by Joseph Abel, prefaced the original orchestral score. Richard George Strauss. The son of a famous horn player, Richard Strauss was born in Munich in 1864. After early success with his tone poems and songs, he finally found the operatic success he longed for with Salome, followed by Elektra. The latter marked the start of a 20-year collaboration with the writer and librettist Hugo von Hofmannsthal, one of the greatest partnerships in operatic history. Strauss's prestige suffered in the 1920s and especially in the 1930s, as his relations with the Nazi Party tarnished his reputation in the English-speaking world. In the 1940s, however, the elderly Strauss, heartbroken by the national catastrophe, produced a series of late works, including the 4 last songs, composed just months before his death in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, in 1949. Other key works: 1888 Don Juan, 1905 Salome, 1911 Der Rosenkavalier, 1949 Four Last Songs. See also, the Four Seasons Faust Symphony, the Ring Cycle Symphonie Fantastique das Lied von der Erde. In context. Focus: Verismo. Before. 1890 winner of a competition for a new one-act opera, Pietro Mascagni's Cavalleria Rusticana launches the Verismo music movement in Rome. 1892 modeled on Cavalleria, Ruggero Leoncavallo's opera Pagliacci is a hit in Milan, consolidating Verismo style. After 1904 Puccini suffers a setback when Madama Butterfly is booed at its premiere in Milan, although it bounces back 3 months later in Brescia. 1926 2 years after Puccini's death, his Turandot, completed by his younger colleague Franco Alfano, is premiered at La Scala in Milan. With the first performance of Cavalleria Rusticana in 1890, a new kind of opera was born. Rather than being based on romanticized historical or legendary subjects, it strove for realism, embracing down-to-earth, sometimes sordid events, lived by believably ordinary people in often contemporary settings. At this time, Puccini, a former flatmate of Cavalleria's composer Pietro Mascagni, was 6 years into an opera career. This had begun in 1884 with Luvili, a picturesque legenda dramatica based on the same story of dead spirits as the romantic ballet Giselle. It was followed 5 years later by Edgar, an opera set in a 14th-century world of medieval knights. Although not the strictest follower of Verismo, Puccini, once the new style became established, took its passionate, heartrending, and cruel elements and clothed them in daring music that reached a breathtaking climax in the tragic opera Tosca. Embracing the realistic. Puccini's first response to Verismo was the opera Manon Lescaut, based on an 18th-century French novel by the Abbé Prévost. This had already been turned into several operas, notably Manon by the opera specialist Jules Massenet. He was one of a number of French composers whose operas had been gaining ground in Italian theaters. These included Faust by Charles Gounod and Carmen, the final masterpiece of Georges Bizet, which shocked critics of the time with its earthy realism and amoral heroine. Although Manon Lescaut was not truly a realist work, it contained 2 scenes in particular that sat squarely in the new style. In Act 3, the poignant spectacle of the embarkation of the prostitutes condemned to transportation, and, in Act 4, the heroine's lengthy death scene in an American desert both provided a focus for some of the most emotionally powerful writing in the score, delivered in a style that epitomized the essence of musical verismo. Puccini's next opera, La Bohème, set among down-at-the-heels artists and their girlfriends in Paris around 1830, was closer to the true subject matter of verismo. It also crystallized the intense sentiment, characterization, and craftsmanship of the musical language of verismo that was widely apparent in Puccini's work. This he handled with a greater degree of flexibility and far more technical variety and finesse than most of his contemporaries. There was also in Puccini's scores a persistent interest in new musical developments from beyond Italy's borders, which added heightened expressive color and richness to his music. He made use of the harmonies, rhythms, and orchestral effects displayed in the works of fellow composers, such as Debussy, Strauss, Stravinsky, and even Schoenberg, but also made modernist musical initiatives of his own, many of which came to the fore in Tosca. Carmen talks to the smuggler Le Donker in a scene from Carmen by Georges Bizet. The opera, with its themes of passion, jealousy, and violence, was an influence on verismo. Giacomo Puccini. Born into a family of church musicians in Lucca in 1858, Puccini claimed to have decided on an operatic career after watching a performance of Verdi's Aida in Pisa in 1876. After studying at the Milan Conservatory, he entered his one-act opera ballet Luvili in a competition. Although it was rejected for being illegible, it was staged by the publisher Giulio Ricordi. Puccini's breakthrough came in 1893 with Manon Lescaut, which put him at the forefront of Italian composers. Thereafter, he produced his 3 greatest successes, La Bohème, Tosca, and Madama Butterfly. His productivity slowed in later years, but the operas La Fanciulla del West, La Rondine, Illinois Tritico, and the posthumously produced Turandot displayed increasing refinement. He died of a heart attack in Brussels in 1924 following an operation for throat cancer. Other key works: 1896 La Bohème, 1904 Madama Butterfly, and 1918 Il Tritico. At the premiere of Tosca, the lead role was played by the Romanian-born 39-year-old soprano Heraclea Darcli, seen here in Act 2 holding the knife she will use to kill Scarpia. Using music for menace. Puccini premiered Tosca, his fifth opera, in Rome in 1900, a time of great uncertainty and instability in Italian politics. Though clothed in the theatrical dress of a period 100 years prior to its opening, the opera dealt with issues and characters that seemed contemporary to its first audience but would become even more starkly relevant as the 20th century progressed. In particular, the figure of Scarpia, the sadistic police chief, who is a presence in the opera musically from its opening bars right through to the final act, seems to prefigure innumerable individuals who, over the next century, served cruel, dictatorial regimes, including fascist Italy. Scarpia is introduced in the concise motif of two chords on lower woodwind, brass, and strings, followed by an unrelated and clashing third chord by the higher strings and woodwind, and a lurid gleam from the cymbals. Every note in this chord sequence is accented and marked FFF. Long before we see him, here stands Scarpia in all his power and brutality. Musically, this tiny motif also throws our expectations of standard harmonic progression out of kilter by landing not only in a key unrelated to the first chord but in a diminished fifth below it, resulting in a tritone. Medieval musical theorists regarded this interval as highly disruptive and forbade its use, calling it diabolus in musica. Puccini, who came from a long line of distinguished church musicians, would certainly have been familiar with the nickname. In a clear break with harmonic orthodoxies, Puccini not only uses the motif to characterize his secular devil figure in the opera but also employs the theme throughout the opera as an emblem of Scarpia's influence on events that take place when he is not present or even alive. The impact of this is to place harmonic instability at the center of the musical action. News of Napoleon's victory at Marengo, pictured here by the French artist Louis-François Lejeune, reaches Rome in Act 2 of Tosca, 3 days after the battle. Real drama. Immediately after the Scarpia theme, the curtain rises on the church of Sant'Andrea della Valle, and we see the fleeing figure of Cesare Angelotti, a political prisoner on the run. Beginning in another unrelated key, the harmonic movement here is much faster. The chord sequence, which, at first, is loud, violent, and consistently moving off the beat, gradually diminishes into a downward slither that ends up, with a feeling of exhaustion, on another tritone. This image of disheveled flight and collapse serves as a second harbinger of what is to come in the opera. The opera's action is based on the play La Tosca by the Frenchman Victorien Sardou, which was criticized at the time for its dizzying tempo of unrelenting action and reaction. Puccini's librettists despaired of making a viable libretto from it, but the composer was able to use daring harmonic instability not only to contain but also to hold together, and even magnify, the play's helter-skelter ride of swiftly changing events as part of his overall musical strategy. Tosca's three central characters all begin the drama with their lives apparently secure, yet through an unpredictable and unstoppable sequence of cause and effect, all three are dead by the curtain in less than 24 hours. Yet Puccini still manages to give all three of his chief characters their moments of lyrical reflection, not simply as opportunities for aria or duet but to voice the hopes, desires, and memories that motivate them and drive the plot. The drama's final impression is of individuals hurtled along by events over which they have little control, and certainly far less than they believe they have. Its emotional and musical power helped to redefine the English tradition of choral music. Opera and the rise of the new reality. Verismo owed its philosophical basis to a literary movement begun in France by the novelists Émile Zola and Honoré de Balzac. It was represented in Italy by the Sicilian Giovanni Verga, whose short story and play Cavalleria Rusticana inspired Mascagni's opera of the same name. The premise of Verismo lay in a scrutiny of the lives of ordinary people, usually urban or rural workers, in a local and everyday setting and often allied to a corresponding focus on the social evils of poverty, crime, and violence. In opera, the new style's emotional extremities were realized in taxing vocal writing, which threw away the remnants of the display and niceties of bel canto in favor of hard-hitting directness. Musical continuity was increased with the dissolution of the old divisions between recitative, arias, and other set pieces. See also, Orfeo ed Eurydice, the Barber of Seville der Freischutz La Traviata, the Wreckers, Peter Grimes. In context. Focus. Exotic worlds and music before 1863, set in Salon, The Pearl Fishers, by rising opera composer Georges Bizet, is a success at its Paris premiere. 1882, Wagner's final opera, Parsifal, blending elements of Buddhist spirituality with Christian ideas and imagery, is first performed at Bayreuth's Festival Theatre. After 1926, Maurice Ravel composes Chansons Matacasses, based on 3 prose poems written in 1787 by Évariste de Parny. 1957, Benjamin Britten conducts the premiere of his ballet The Prince of the Pagodas in London. The score is influenced by Indonesian gamelan music, which Britten heard in Bali in 1956. When Gustav Mahler began work on the 6 settings of Chinese poems that make up Das Lied von der Erde, he was exploring what was for him new territory. But exotic Oriental subject matter was already a familiar theme in European art and culture, reflecting the yearning of the popular imagination for more colorful and intriguing worlds. This sense of longing had come into sharper focus in the 15th and 16th centuries, when long-distance sea voyages had led to the discovery of unknown regions. The decisive impetus for the cult of exoticism came in the 19th century, as European powers busily pursued global empire-building rivalries. At home, industrialization created rapid growth in towns and cities, with populations living and working in oppressive conditions that generated an inner need for psychological escape. Mahler wrote Das Lied von der Erde while staying at the Hotel Bellevue in the Italian town of Cortina. The peaks of the Dolomites provided a dramatic backdrop for his compositions. Selling the exotic. The world of literature latched onto the sales possibilities of exotic subject matter, as in the South Seas Tales of Robert Louis Stevenson or the romanticized Native American world depicted in the Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Exoticism also flourished among painters. French artist Paul Gauguin moved to the French Polynesian island of Tahiti in 1891 to explore new avenues of artistic expression, aware that the European vogue for the exotic would ensure sales of his work in Paris. European classical music, too, was drawn to the imagined sounds of enticing worlds to the south and east. Operas were set in alluringly foreign settings, such as Giuseppe Verdi's Aida, a fictional story of ancient Egypt. In orchestral music, Russia's Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov based his symphonic suite Scheherazade on stories from a collection of Middle Eastern folktales that became known as the Arabian Nights. The French composer Claude Debussy found the piano especially suitable for suggesting images of remote worlds, using Javanese melodies and pagodas from his Estamps of 1903. Life Through New Eyes. Before he composed Das Lied von der Erde, Mahler did not seem to be influenced by the growing European love of exoticism. His choice of texts for his songs and symphonies had come mostly from one particular area of Austro-German culture, the folk poetry, usually anonymous, assembled by Achim von Arnim and Clemens Brentano in their collection Des Knaben Wunderhorn, published in 1805 and 1808. For Lieder eins Verending Gesellen, Mahler had written his own texts in a similar folk style, with a wide range of emotional moods projected against the surrounding, vividly perceived world of nature. Gustav Mahler. The second of 14 children of Jewish parents, Mahler was born in 1860 and spent his childhood in the Czech-speaking town of Igla. He gave his first piano recital at age 10 and 5 years later entered the Vienna Conservatory. His cantata Das Klagende Lied showed amazing early self-awareness, exploring a spectral, folk-tale world in a vivid orchestral style. A stellar conducting career led to the composer's appointment in 1897 as artistic director of the Vienna Court Opera. Mahler wrote most of his music, largely song settings and symphonies, during summers among the Austrian lakes. Departure from the Vienna Court Opera in 1907 was followed by conducting work in New York. Mahler died soon after returning to Europe from America in 1911. Other key works: 1888-1894 Symphony No. 2, 1892-1901 Des Knaben Wunderhorn, 1908-1909 Symphony No. 9. East meets West. Mahler did not, however, ignore Eastern culture. The song cycle Kindertotenlieder, composed in 1901-1904, was based on poems by Friedrich Ruckert, a German professor of Eastern languages. Ruckert's writings were influenced by the Eastern concept of serene acceptance of life and death, rather than the keenness for turbulent self-dramatization of both displayed in Western Romanticism. When Mahler read a copy of Die Chinesische Flotte, a collection of Chinese poems adapted by German poet Hans Bethe, in autumn 1907, the composer was already familiar with the artistic world within its pages. Mahler's life was also in a turbulent state, coloring his view of life and death. The devastating death of his 4-year-old daughter in the summer of 1907 was followed by the onset of a heart condition that required Mahler to slow down. In a letter to the conductor Bruno Walter, his former assistant at the Vienna Court Opera, Mahler wrote, "I have always known that I must die. But all at once I have lost the serenity and clarity which I had acquired. I have to start a new life as a complete beginner." Bethe's adaptation of the original Chinese text was not particularly faithful. He knew no Chinese and used a German translation of a French translation of the original. In effect, Bethe's poems were beautifully written paraphrases, evoking an emotional world that was by turns anguished, poignant, idyllic, resigned, drunken, or quietly radiant, all reflected in exquisitely drawn scenes from nature. This approach connected more to the world of German lyric poetry that was familiar to Mahler than to the 9th-century Chinese originals, with their ultra-concentrated diction. Still, Mahler alluded to exotic influences by using the Oriental 5-note pentatonic scale, providing an element of local color that his European audiences would easily recognize. Is it at all bearable? Will it drive people to do away with themselves? Gustav Mahler. Large ambitions. In Das Lied von der Erde, Mahler managed to combine his two principal musical concerns, song and the symphony, in a single large-scale work for the first time. In his second, third, and fourth symphonies, there had been a substantial overlapping of the two genres. In Das Lied von der Erde their fusion is so complete that neither can be separated out. A tenor and mezzo-soprano alternate in the 6 song settings, and Mahler deploys a large orchestra with exceptional sensibility to mood and color, often with the finesse of a chamber group of solo instruments. The opening Das Trinklied vom Jammer der Erde, music of wild and despairing fatalism, is followed by the desolate depiction of a mist-covered lake in Der Einsame im Herbst. Then comes a group of 3 shorter settings, prominently colored by the pentatonic scale, recalling the innocent happiness of youth and the joys of springtime. The final setting, Der Abschied, is longer than the other 5 songs combined. 2 different poems are here separated by an orchestral interlude and lead eventually to a conclusion with words added by Mahler himself, "Everywhere the dear earth blossoms forth in spring and grows green again. Everywhere and forever, distant horizons gleam blue, forever. Forever." The music seems not so much to end as to dissolve into this vision, in which awareness of human mortality is transcended by the perception that life and the natural world will timelessly be renewed. The work as a whole relates more to Mahler's deepest creative and personal concerns than to a fashion for exoticism's sake, but, without that fashion and the inspiration Mahler found in Eastern culture, Das Lied von der Erde could not have existed. Mahler's diverse influences are satirized in this caricature of him conducting his Symphony No. 1 in D major, from a November 1900 edition of Illustriertes Wiener Extrablatt. Mahler's struggles are those of a psychic weakling, a complaining adolescent who enjoyed his misery, wanting the whole world to see how he was suffering. Harold Schönberg. American critic. See also, Prélude à l'après-midi d'un fond le sacre du printemps November Steps Lemore de Loin. Introduction. As the 19th century progressed, a growing mood of nationalism developed, and people sought individual identities as nations distinct from the old empires. The dominant culture in Europe was Germanic, and this was especially true of the music being written for the concert halls and opera houses. A tradition of folk music thrived almost everywhere, as regional and local cultures of the many different people asserted themselves. It was this that provided the inspiration for composers wishing to establish a musical identity that matched the nationalistic ideals of their people. Opera was an obvious starting point, as it could be based on national history and legends, but the same ideas were also expressed in programmatic orchestral works. Nationalism in music did not confine itself to subject matter. Composers incorporated folk songs and dances into their music or composed their own melodies using elements of a particular tradition of folk music, such as its scales and rhythms. Russia leads. The first signs of nationalism in music came from Russia, which had started to assert its independence from European culture at the beginning of the Romantic period. Mikhail Glinka's operas were based on Russian stories, with Russian folk tunes presented in the Romantic style, inspiring more than a century of distinctively Russian music. Quick to take up the baton, Mily Balakirev gathered together a group of Russian composers who became known as the Five or Mighty Handful, whose work later influenced Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, Alexander Glazunov, and, in the 20th century, Sergei Rachmaninoff. The wave of nationalism gained momentum in the mid-19th century, especially as the Austro-Hungarian Empire crumbled. Countries were proud of their own folk culture, and especially their music. Chopin tinged much of his piano music with inflections of folk melodies from his native Poland, and wrote several polonaises, while Liszt incorporated Hungarian dance styles into his work. More overtly nationalistic was Bedřich Smetana, who became a champion of Czech nationalism with operas in his native language on Czech themes. Later Czech composers included Antonín Dvořák and Leos Janáček. Nationalism in music spread north into Scandinavia, too, with folk-inspired music from Edvard Grieg, Carl Nielsen, and John Sibelius, and south to Spain, where composers such as Isaac Albéniz and Manuel de Falla tapped into a particularly rich source of folk music. American sounds. As Antonín Dvořák discovered when he visited the U.S. at the end of the century, America had also developed its own musical voice, a mix of styles and traditions that reflected the diversity of its people. It was also a young culture, finding its way after centuries of following Europe's lead. Although Native Americans had a long-established folk culture, the more recent settlers had yet to develop one. As a result, composers such as Louis Moreau Gottschalk borrowed from the songs and dances of slaves in the southern states and the melting pot of sounds in places like New Orleans. These forms eventually evolved into ragtime and jazz. The spirituals of the African slaves influenced popular songwriters such as Stephen Foster. Along with the hymn tunes sung by the early settlers, they formed the basis for an American classical tradition pioneered by Edward MacDowell and Charles Ives. In Europe, some countries did not feel the same need to flex their nationalist muscles. Italy and Germany were in the process of unification, but their cultures, especially their musical cultures, needed little reinforcement. The same was true to a lesser extent of France, but composers such as Gabriel Fauré and Camille Saint-Saëns sought to distance themselves from the Germanic Romantic style and wrote music that was lighter and more transparent. In Britain, where composers generally accepted German domination of music, Edward Elgar embraced the richness of the orchestral sound and harmonies of German music but pursued a nationalistic intent, with evocations of the English landscape and themes. Later English composers, such as Ralph Vaughan Williams, came to use this style as a vehicle to carry folk tunes. In context. Focus. 19th century Czech opera before 1826 František Skrzypek, widely regarded as the first Czech opera, has its premiere. 1842-1845 Czech poet and historian Karel Urban publishes a pioneering collection of Bohemian folk songs. 1865 Karel Sebeir's opera Templari na Moravě is performed to local acclaim at Prague's Provisional Theatre. After 1901 Rusalka, Antonín Dvořák's most successful opera, is premiered at Prague's National Theatre. 1904 Leos Janáček's opera Jinfa is performed for the first time in the Czech city of Brno. The second and best loved of Czech composer Bedřich Smetana's operas, The Bartered Bride, is about two young lovers, Mařenka and Jenikin, in a Bohemian village. They want to marry, but Mařenka's parents, swayed by the village marriage broker, intend her to wed Vasek, the simple-minded son of a wealthy landlord. Jenik and Mařenka are united in the end, and Jenik is revealed as the long-lost son of Vasek's rich father. The opera is a melding of French and Italian influences with inspiration from Czech folk settings and traditions, particularly dances such as the polka and the furion. The Bartered Bride is only a toy, and composing it was merely child's play. At the time of writing, it was my opinion that not even Offenbach could compete with it. Bedřich Smetana. A new Czech identity. During the 1860s and 1870s, Smetana almost single-handedly created Czech opera by writing operas in the Czech language. Czech culture had long been influenced by the Habsburg Empire. By the mid-19th century, however, nationalist aspirations were strong, and these grew in 1860 when the imperial authorities handed greater powers to the Czech parliament in Prague. Funds were raised to build a theater for Czech drama and opera, and it was here that Smetana's first two operas were premiered. He completed 6 more operas, along with a cycle of symphonic poems called Má vlast, celebrating Czech landscapes and culture. See also, The Magic Flute, The Barber of Seville, Der Freischütz, La Traviata, The Ring Cycle. In context. Focus. Nationalism in 19th century Russian music before 1815, in St. Petersburg, Venetian-born Katerino Kavos composes Ivan Suzanin, the first opera about Russian characters, based on Russian history, and incorporating Russian folk music. 1836 Mikhail Glinka's A Life for the Tsar has its premiere in St. Petersburg. It is the first all-sung opera by a native Russian composer. After 1896 Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov undertakes the first of his revisions of Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godunov. For decades, these remain the most performed versions. 1922 French composer Maurice Ravel produces an orchestrated version of Pictures at an exhibition. The Russian composer Modest Mussorgsky's Pictures at an exhibition is a piano suite in 10 movements. Each movement was inspired by the work of fellow Russian Victor Hartmann, an architect and artist. Mussorgsky belonged to a generation of composers who, in the 1860s, gave Russian music its first distinctive voice. He was part of a group nicknamed The Five, also known as the Mighty Handful, who sought to create music without being confined by Western European conventions. Besides Mussorgsky, the Five were Mily Balakirev, the group's initial guiding spirit, Alexander Borodin, a scientist as well as a musician, Cesar Chue, best known as a critic, and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who played a key role in mentoring a new generation of composers, including Alexander Scriabin and Sergei Rachmaninoff. Pictures at an exhibition was composed shortly after the premiere of Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godunov in January 1874, which marked the public high point of his career. The piano suite was not performed in the composer's lifetime, but its intensity and complexity, and distinctly Russian subject matter, helped to achieve the ultimate ambition of the Five to give Russian music its own unmistakable voice. The early, alcohol-induced death of Mussorgsky, painted here by Ilya Repy in 1881, the year that he died, left Rimsky-Korsakov and other composers to finish or revise his work. See also, Dvořák's Symphony No. 9 Le Sacre du Printemps Romeo and Juliet Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. In context. Focus. Music for the theater before 1810 Beethoven writes the incidental music to Goethe's tragic play Egmont. 1843 Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream opens in Potsdam with Mendelssohn's music. 1872 Grieg composes music for Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson's Sigurd Jorsalfar, celebrating King Sigurd I of Norway. After 1908 La Mort du Duc de Guise, a film with a score by Camille Saint-Saëns, opens in Paris. 1915 Edward Elgar writes the incidental music for The Starlight Express, a children's play by Violet Pern. Incidental music has probably existed as long as theater itself. It was intrinsic to Shakespeare's plays, which include cues for instrumental music as well as songs, some 100 in total, although no scores have survived. By the late 1700s, Europe's major theaters would employ a substantial orchestra, and sometimes vocal soloists and a chorus, to accompany plays. Examples of incidental music of the 18th and early 19th century include Mozart's The Mose, King of Egypt, Beethoven's Egmont, and Schubert's Rosamunde, which were of sufficient quality to make it into the concert hall. The music that Felix Mendelssohn composed for a German-language production of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream was one of the most successful pieces to make such a transition. It was first staged in Potsdam, Germany, in 1843, including a masterful overture written when the composer was just 17. While under the patronage of Frederick IV, King of Prussia, Mendelssohn would go on to compose incidental music for productions of Oedipus at Colonus and Racine's Athalie in 1845. In 1849, Robert Schumann wrote music to accompany Byron's dramatic poem Manfred. The Dance of the Trolls was illustrated in macabre style by the British artist Arthur Rackham for an edition of Ibsen's Peer Gynt. Norwegian collaboration. When Henrik Ibsen, Norway's most celebrated writer, completed Peer Gynt, based on a Norwegian folk hero, in 1867, he thought of it as a poetic drama, to be read rather than staged. 7 years later, when Ibsen adapted his work for a full-scale stage production, he invited another internationally renowned Norwegian artist, Edvard Grieg, to compose music for the first production. Grieg had already produced successful incidental music for Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson's play Sigurd Jorsalfar. The collaboration between Ibsen and Grieg would elevate Peer Gynt to the status of national epic. I have also written something for the scene in the Hall of the Mountain King. It absolutely reeks of cow pies, exaggerated Norwegian provincialism, and trollish self-sufficiency. Edvard Grieg. Emotive music. Grieg eventually produced more than 20 individual pieces for the numerous cues in Ibsen's 5-act drama, reflecting the emotional mood of each moment, from the uproar of the Hall of the Mountain King to the grief-filled death of Ase, Peer Gynt's mother. Grieg later assembled 8 of the most substantial of these into 2 orchestral suites, which have become standard concert hall works. They include movements that reference the major characters and scenes in the drama: Ase, Anitra, a Bedouin chief's daughter whom Peer tries to seduce; Ingrid, the farmer's daughter he abducts on the eve of her wedding; the troll kingdom into which he stumbles; and Solveig, the faithful woman who waits patiently for his return. Genre in decline. Later examples of incidental music that survive outside their original theatrical contexts include Faurès and Sibelius's music for Pelléas et Melisande, Debussy's Le Martyr de Saint Sebastian, Elgar's The Starlight Express, and Sibelius's The Tempest. Incidental music is still commissioned for some theatrical productions but is generally performed with fewer musicians or even pre-recorded. Modern examples include Michael Tippett's music for The Tempest and Harrison Birtwhistle's Orestia. Some characteristics of the genre have migrated to film, television, and even video games. The more he saturated his mind with, the more clearly he saw that he was the right man for a work so permeated with the Norwegian spirit. Nina Hagerup. Grieg's wife. Edvard Grieg. Grieg was taught to play the piano by his mother, a music teacher in the Norwegian town of Bergen, where he was born in 1843. As a teenager, Grieg met the internationally acclaimed violinist Ole Bull, who urged his parents to send him to study at the Leipzig Conservatoire. There, he was influenced by Schumann and Mendelssohn. It was only later, in Copenhagen, that Grieg became interested in the Norwegian folk tunes that inspired his music. In 1867, Grieg married his cousin Nina Hagerup, for whom he composed many songs. The following year, he wrote his one-piano concerto, which, like Peer Gynt, brought lasting fame. In later life, he devoted himself to smaller piano works, especially the 10 volumes of lyric pieces, some of which draw on folk idioms. Grieg died in Bergen in 1907. Other key works. 1868 Piano Concerto in a minor, Op. 16 1872 Sigurd Jorsalfar 1884 Hallberg Suite 1902-1903 Slatter. See also, The Bartered Bride Pictures at an exhibition Dvorak's Symphony No. 9 Finlandia Appalachian Spring. In context. Focus Requiem Mass. Before 1837 Hector Berlioz composes his Grande Messe de Morts for a large choir, enormous orchestra, and 4 offstage brass ensembles. 1874 Verdi's Operatic Requiem for 4 vocal soloists, double choir, and orchestra has its first performance. After 1913 Faurè's opera Penelope is premiered. While the influence of Wagner is more apparent than in earlier works, it still has an understated quality. 1948 Maurice Durufel completes his Requiem, which, like Faurès, includes the Pai Jesu, Liberami, and In Paradisum sections. It is unlikely that Faure wrote his Requiem in direct response to the death of any individual, although the recent deaths of his parents may have focused his mind on the project. The composer stated that his main motivation was to produce an original requiem. He was familiar with the form, having spent years as a choirmaster and organist, during which he had accompanied numerous funerals. The differences began with the text. For set a shortened version of the Latin Mass for the dead, omitting, among other passages, the sequence section, with its passage on the Dies Irae, which so many previous composers had used as an opportunity to produce loud and dramatic music. This was replaced in Faurè's first version of the score by a setting of Pai Jesu, a prayer to Jesus for everlasting rest, at the end of which he also added an extra movement, In Paradisum, that comes not from the Mass but from the burial service. The unusual selection of texts is matched with a distinctive choice of instruments to accompany the mixed choir and soloists, no violin section, but only violas, cellos, and double basses, a harp, trumpets, horns, trombones, organ, and timpani. In addition, a solo violin soars above the harp and lower strings in the Sanctus. Faure clearly intended the work to be played by this unusual ensemble, but upon receiving the score in 1890, his publishers requested a version for full orchestra. An arrangement with added violins and woodwind instruments was published in 1900. Many musicians, however, favor the earlier version. Faure plays the piano at the home of the Catalan composer Isaac Albéniz. With them is the Belgian composer and conductor Leon Gehin and Albéniz pupil Clara Sansoni. Serenity and calm. The music of Faurè's Requiem is skillfully restrained, matching the themes of consolation and eternal rest in the text. It has relatively few loud passages, in contrast to requiems by composers such as Berlioz or Verdi. Faure was seeking a style that differed both from the more dramatic, romantic approach of composers such as Wagner in Germany and the lyrical bel canto style of choral writing, then popular in France, with its emphasis on a singer's virtuosity. His is more carefully balanced, with subtle changes in harmony and dynamics. Although the work was not immediately well received, Faure opened new avenues for French music, paving the way for later French composers such as Ravel and Debussy. Faurès is now one of the most popular settings of the Requiem in the choral repertoire. Gabriel Faure. Born in 1845 in Pamiers in southwest France, Gabriel Faure showed an early musical talent and was sent to the École Niedermeyer de Paris. The school's focus was on church music, and when he left, Faure worked in a succession of jobs as church organist in Brittany and then in Paris, in both places giving private music lessons to supplement his income. In later life, Faure became professor of composition at the Paris Conservatoire and finally its director. Although his busy professional life left him little time for composing, Faure produced many short piano pieces, notable chamber music, including 2 piano quartets and 2 piano quintets, 2 orchestral suites, many fine songs, and a string quartet completed in 1924, the year he died. By this time highly acclaimed, Faure was given a state funeral. Other key works. 1879-1883 Piano Quartet No. 1 in C minor, Op. 15. 1894 La Bonne Chanson, Op. 61 1919 Masques et Bergamasques, Op. 112. See also, Canticum Canticorum ein Festberg ist unser Gott Street Matthew Passion Elijah The Dream of Gerontius. In context. Focus. Nationalism and folk music before. 1723 Czech composer Dismas Zelenka writes his Ovicha Oz 7 concert anti. 1776 Czech-born Johann Baptist van Hal publishes 6 symphonies, Op. 23, works that influence classical style. 1862 Bedřich Smedna composes the opera The Brandenburgers in Bohemia, which is a great success. After 1904 Leos Janáček premieres his opera Jenfa, which uses speech tunes based on a Moravian dialect of Czech. 1905 08 Béla Bartók and Zoltán Kodály visit Hungarian villages to research and record traditional songs and dances. Bohemia, the largest and westernmost region of the Czech Republic today, was formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For centuries, its capital Prague enjoyed a rich musical life, strongly influenced by German and Austrian composers. In the late 18th century, Mozart visited 5 times, wrote a Prague symphony, and premiered his opera Don Giovanni in the city. By the mid-1800s, however, fueled by a failed revolution in 1848, a nationalist movement was underway that would have a powerful impact on all the arts. In music, both Bedřich Smedna and Antonín Dvořák began to use classical European symphonic and chamber forms to produce works of a strongly patriotic nature that incorporated the spirit of regional folk songs and dances. The Bohemian polka, illustrated here by Hermann Koenig, is attributed to Anna Slezakova, who danced the steps to a folk song in 1834. Dvořák's earliest surviving composition was a polka. 2 composers. Dvořák was an accomplished keyboard player and violinist, who had played in several Prague orchestras when he joined the one at the city's provincial theatre in 1866, conducted by Smedna. The older Smedna was already cultivating a reputation as a champion of a Czech style of music after spending most of his early creative years in Sweden. Smedna's first language was German, and he had only recently begun to study Czech when he responded to a contest to compose a Czech opera. He submitted The Brandenburgers in Bohemia, which premiered in 1866, and went on to produce many celebrated works in Czech, such as The Bartered Bride, a set of symphonic poems called Má vlast, and Vltava, which paints the course of the river running through Prague. Inspired by Smedna's Czech operas, Dvořák composed Alfred in 1870, but it was not performed in his lifetime. His next, The King in the Charcoal Burner, was at first rejected as unplayable, though eventually accepted after extensive rewrites. Dvořák gave up his place in the theater orchestra to concentrate on composition, and the critical success of his stirring hymn of Czech national pride The Airs of the White Mountain marked the beginning of his recognition as a composer. By 1880, Dvořák had cemented his reputation as the greatest of the Czech nationalist composers, particularly through his Slavonic dances, inspired by Brahms's Hungarian dances. However, Dvořák's approach to his orchestral dances was quite different from that used by Brahms. Whereas the Viennese composer made verbatim use of traditional tunes for his collection, Dvořák's lively dances did not borrow but were newly composed orchestral works imbued with national character. His Czech suite, for example, has 2 movements completely modeled on Bohemian folk dances, the polka, in the 2nd movement, and the slow Sasečka in the 4th. Dvořák's 7th and 8th symphonies were also particularly Bohemian. The 7th has clear Slavonic influences, while the 8th sounds like a joyful folk celebration. Originally a Bohemian peasant dance, the polka has 2 strong beats in each bar, inviting dancers to step in lively, bouncing fashion. It became a popular ballroom dance in the 1830s. Antonín Dvořák. The son of an innkeeper, Dvořák was born in a village north of Prague in 1841. He shared his father's passion for the violin, and from 1857 he also studied the organ in Prague, playing the instrument in several orchestras. By the early 1870s, Dvořák had taken up composition full-time and was married to Anna, with whom he would have 9 children. Dvořák's career was aided by Johannes Brahms, who sat on a panel that awarded Dvořák a grant to pursue his music. He also recommended Dvorak to his publisher, who encouraged him to write a set of Slavonic dances. Their publication changed his fortunes. New commissions at home and from England soon followed. Dvorak directed the National Conservatory of Music in New York from 1892-1895, before returning to Prague to teach and write new works based on Bohemian folk tales. He died from a stroke in 1904. Other key works: 1878 Slavonic Dances, Book 1, Op. 46, 1885 Symphony No. 7, Op. 70 1900 Rusalka, Op. 144. Harry Burleigh was the first black composer to write down spirituals, influencing future American music. Dvorak greatly admired his fine baritone voice and the songs he sang. The New World. By the end of the century, Dvorak's fame was spreading beyond his homeland to England and the United States. In 1891, New York musical philanthropist Jeanette Thurber asked Dvorak to direct her National Conservatory of Music. Knowing that he had done much to establish Czech music, she wanted him to inspire her students to find a path toward an American national musical style. Dvorak, however, was reluctant to leave Prague for a long contract and initially turned down the offer, although he gave in to pressure to accept, after his family heard that the salary he would earn per annum was equivalent to working 25 years at the Prague Conservatory. Among the talented students that Thurber encouraged to apply to her conservatory, regardless of gender, ethnicity, or disability, was an African-American singer, Henry Thacker Burleigh, who enrolled in 1892, contributing to his fees by working as a handyman and cleaner in the building. His singing attracted the attention of Dvorak, and Burleigh later recalled singing old African-American hymns to the composer. "I gave him what I knew of Negro songs." Listening and responding. These Negro spirituals, as they came to be known, were among the musical ideas that Dvorak drew on in his Symphony No. 9, in which he turned his attention from his native folk music to that of his adopted home. From the New World was inspired by both plantation songs and Native American chants. Dvorak felt strongly that this music of the poor of America could serve as the rootstock for a national musical style. While some people hear "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" in the symphony's first movement, at its premiere, Dvorak denied using existing Native and African American songs. Dvorak believed there was a distinction between inspiration and imitation, whether singing under his breath in the orchestra pit or going straight from work to jot down ideas. His method was not to copy but rather to listen then respond in his own voice. As well as these musical styles, Dvorak was inspired by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Ojibwe romance The Song of Hiawatha in writing his symphony. The third movement, for example, was suggested by the scene in Hiawatha at the feast where the Native Americans dance. For the second movement, evoking Longfellow's description of the death of Minnehaha, Dvorak uses the stentorian chords of the low-wind instruments to introduce the beautiful melody of the Cor Anglais. Here, he also drew on the old Eastern European tradition of funerary brass music, maintained in America by the trombone choirs of Moravian communities, who would announce a death with the playing of trombones from the church belfry. In the Negro melodies of America I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. Antonin Dvorak. For his voyage to a new world, the Apollo 11 mission to the moon in 1969, Neil Armstrong took a recording of Dvorak's Symphony No. 9 and is said to have listened to it as he stepped out. Lasting influence. In spring 1893, Dvorak's family joined him in the Moravian community of Spillville, Iowa, enjoying the company of their Czech compatriots as he completed his Symphony No. 9, the echoes of which would be heard in the music of American composers, such as Aaron Copland, George Gershwin, and Duke Ellington. Dvorak himself returned to Prague in 1895 and again took to composing works inspired by the dances, legends, and folklore of his homeland. See also, The Bartered Bride Finlandia, The Lark Ascending Janáček's Sinfonietta Bartók's String Quartet No. 5. In context. Focus. American nationalism before 1640. The Bay Psalm Book is published in Massachusetts. 1834. Anthony Heinrich composes the Treaty of William Penn with the Indians, a concerto grosso. 1848. Stephen Foster publishes the song O. Susanna, which becomes an instant hit. 1863 Louis Moreau Gottschalk publishes Battle Cry of Freedom, based on an American Civil War song. After 1897 John Philip Sousa's March the Stars and Stripes Forever premieres. The first music published in North America were tunes in the Bay Psalm Book, a compilation selected from European psalters by the 17th century immigrants who settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. By the late 18th century, however, American-born composers such as William Billings and Daniel Reed, who formed part of the first New England school, began to publish music that marked a distinct departure from European models. These composers, who were usually self-taught, were writing new types of sacred music, such as the fuguing tune, in which a choral melody is sung in unison and then in counterpoint but with scant regard for traditional Western standards of harmony. A House of Dreams Untold, it looks out over the whispering treetops and faces the setting Sunday. Edward MacDowell. America's First. The Bohemian-born Anthony Heinrich, who lived in the United States from 1810, is generally considered the first professional American composer. Inspired by different parts of the United States, he developed a more dissonant harmonic language than had been heard elsewhere and was the first American to write for a symphony orchestra. More famous, however, was the virtuoso pianist Louis Moreau Gottschalk, who studied in Paris and was feted by Chopin and Liszt. Returning to America in 1853, he toured widely, performing his own works that would often reference the indigenous music and instruments of the New World. As American tastes evolved, a new group of composers emerged, now known as the Second New England School. The strongest influence for these composers was the German Romantic tradition, and a number of them studied in Europe. The best remembered of this group is Edward MacDowell. He was mentored by Liszt, who introduced the young composer to publishers in Leipzig during his time in Germany. Country life. MacDowell published orchestral works, concertos, sonatas, and songs, but is universally identified with miniature piano pieces, and most particularly the Woodland Sketches of 1896. Following on from a tradition started by Mendelssohn and Schumann, writing suites of short works aimed at the amateur domestic market, these could also be seen as a counterpart to Grieg's contemporaneous lyric pieces due to their inherent nationalism and celebration of the countryside. Woodland Sketches is an opus of 10 pieces. Possibly inspired by MacDowell's move to the farm that later became the artist's colony bearing his name, they celebrate not only the landscape but also the everyday American experience. In parts such as A Deserted Farm and At an Old Trysting Place, they also borrowed some melodic material from Native American songs. Tending towards starker textures than European Romantic piano music, and occasionally verging on impressionistic harmony, as in the more complex By a Meadow Brook, these sketches contain elements that became a part of the American musical language of the 1920s and 1930s. The MacDowell Colony in New Hampshire, pictured here in 1948, has supported thousands of artists since 1907. MacDowell's pianist wife, Marion, led the colony for almost 25 years. Edward MacDowell. Born in New York in 1860, MacDowell studied the piano from early childhood and, at the age of 17, was offered a scholarship to the Paris Conservatoire. After his time in Paris, he went to Frankfurt to study composition with Joachim Raff. Raff introduced him to Franz Liszt, who arranged a performance of MacDowell's first modern suite, Op. 10 in Zurich. In 1888, MacDowell returned to New York and premiered his Piano Concerto No. 2. He was then invited to create a department of music at Columbia University. 8 years later, he resigned in a dispute over courses. Amid the bad publicity, MacDowell suffered a nervous breakdown and further health problems. He never recovered. Just before his death in 1908, he and his wife established the MacDowell Colony, where artists of all kinds are supported in residence. Other key works: 1883 First Modern Suite, Op. 10. 1890 Piano Concerto No. 2, Op. 23. 1892 Indian Suite, Op. 48. See also, Dvorak's Symphony No. 9, Ives's Symphony No. 4 Rhapsody in Blue Ionization. Appalachian Spring. In context. Focus. English choral tradition before 1846. Mendelssohn's oratorio Elijah has its first performance in Birmingham, England. 1857. At the Handel Festival in London, England, choirs of up to 2,000 sing Handel's Messiah and other oratorios. 1882. Wagner's Parsifal, based on a 13th-century German epic poem, is his last and, for some, his greatest opera. After 1903. Elgar continues to develop large-scale choral works with the Apostles. 1939. 1941. Michael Tippett composes his secular oratorio A Child of Our Time, which extends the oratorio still further with the inclusion of American spirituals in the score. In 1898, Edward Elgar was commissioned to write a new large-scale choral piece for the 1900 Birmingham Festival. Elgar, a Catholic, chose to set the poem The Dream of Gerontius by Cardinal John Henry Newman. In the poem, Gerontius, a devout old man, dreams of his death and the journey of his soul immediately after he dies. Elgar poured his own heart and soul into the work, inscribing it with a quote from the social thinker John Ruskin that began, "This is the best of me." England had a strong tradition of amateur choral singing in the late 19th century, and many English composers wrote oratorios, large-scale choral works on sacred themes. Few of these pieces stood the test of time, and Elgar decided to produce something different. Oratorios, like the operas of Mozart, were usually made up of separate musical numbers, such as arias and choruses. But with the work of late Romantic composers such as Richard Wagner, opera had evolved. Wagner's operas consist of music that flows continuously, without a break, enabling the composer to build huge climaxes and express deep emotions. Elgar used this technique for The Dream of Gerontius, rejecting the term oratorio due to this lack of breaks between pieces. Like Wagner, he employed a large orchestra with a substantial brass section and percussionists to reinforce the climaxes and underpin the most dramatic moments. There is music in the air, music all around us, the world is full of it and you simply take as much as you require. Edward Elgar. The Soul's Journey. The Dream of Gerontius is in two parts. Part 1 portrays the death of Gerontius. It includes the gentle prayers of his friends by his bedside, his passionate credo, Sanctus Fortis, which expresses both his steadfast faith and his anxieties, and the final swell of singers and orchestra in the chorus that exhorts Gerontius to go forth upon thy journey, Christian soul. In Part 2, Gerontius' soul is guided by an angel past demons, who sing a sardonic fugal chorus, and a choir of angels, whose hymn Praise to the Holiest in the Height begins with a dramatic triple forte and ends in intricate 8-part harmony. This leads toward the climax, a deafening orchestral crescendo as the soul is finally led to judgment. Elgar rewrote this climactic passage at the insistence of his friend and publisher August Jaeger, who asked for something more dramatic than the composer's first attempt. The piece ends with the soul being taken in the arms of the angel and dipped into the soothing waters of purgatory. From disaster to success. Due to poorly prepared performers, The Dream of Gerontius had a disastrous premiere in Birmingham in 1900. However, after acclaimed performances in Germany, the work established itself as one of Elgar's masterpieces, a daring work for its time that develops late Romantic operatic style into a choral work, combines it with resourceful orchestral writing, and produces a setting of unusual power. The Dream of Gerontius quickly transcended the question of doctrine that almost denied it an early performance in Worcester Cathedral, Cardinal Newman's words seeming too Catholic for the Anglican Church. Its emotional force and abiding themes of loss and hope in the face of death continue to exercise a universal appeal to audiences of every faith. Edward Elgar. Born in 1857 near Worcester, England, where his father owned a music shop, Elgar was largely a self-taught musician. As a young man, he played in orchestras and gave music lessons, marrying Alice Roberts, one of his pupils, in 1889. She encouraged him to move to London and spend more time on composition. His breakthrough work was Enigma Variations, after which he wrote a series of large-scale compositions, including The Apostles, a violin concerto, and 2 symphonies, which brought him recognition in Britain and Europe. Although depressed by World War I, in 1919 he wrote his string quartet, Piano Quintet, and Cello Concerto. After Alice's death in 1920, Elgar composed little. He received many honors, but his music was out of fashion when he died in 1934. Other key works: 1899 Enigma Variations, 1901, 1930 Pomp and Circumstance Marches, 1905 Introduction and Allegro for Strings, 1919 Cello Concerto in E minor. See also, Great Service Street Matthew Passion Elijah The Ring Cycle A Child of Our Time. In context. Focus. Finnish musical resistance to Russian political domination before 1848. German-born Frederick Pacius composes the song Vartland to Swedish words by Finnish poet Johan Ludvig Ruberg. After Finland's independence in 1917, a Finnish translation, Mom, is adopted as the country's national anthem. 1892 Sibelius becomes a national celebrity when he first conducts his part choral symphonic poem Kalervo, with texts from the Finnish national epic poem Kalevala. After 1917 Sibelius composes a Jaeger march in support of the Finnish Jaeger Battalion, trained in Germany to fight the Russian Empire in World War I. Out of all the musical nationalism that took shape during the 19th century in the four Nordic nations, Finland's was perhaps the most powerful. In Jan Sibelius, Finland produced a composer who, even more than Norway's Edvard Grieg, Sweden's Franz Berwald, and Denmark's Carl Nielsen, captured the essence of his people and nation as they strove to throw off the shackles of foreign domination. For nearly 700 years, up to the early 19th century, Finland had been part of the Swedish Empire, and the language of the educated and governing classes was Swedish. When Sibelius was born into a Swedish-speaking family, Finland as a nation still did not exist. Since 1809, it had been a Grand Duchy of Imperial Russia, which imposed a resented autocratic rule. Against this uneasy backdrop, the Finnish language, spoken by urban and rural workers, became associated with a growing national resistance. Sibelius had been to a Finnish-speaking school, so when his talent as a composer propelled him to the forefront of Finnish cultural life, he was ideally positioned to respond to the cultural interests of both linguistic communities. Besides mastery of powerful, large-scale symphonic forms, he had a flair for popular light music and sought out examples of Finnish folk music. Sibelius captured the epic beauty of Finland's landscape, seen here in a view over the taiga forest, in the majestic string settings of Finlandia. A Finnish fightback. In 1899, Russia proclaimed its February Manifesto, which cracked down on Finnish autonomy and nationalism, including a ban on political rallies and the closure of a Finnish-language newspaper. An evening of press celebrations was organized in the capital, Helsinki, officially in support of the Press Pension Fund but was in reality a gathering of patriotic resistance. The evening included the display of specially painted tableaus, for which Sibelius was asked to compose the music. The last of these, Finland Awakes, portrayed the region's proud achievements in culture and industry. Sibelius then arranged some of the music for concert performance, revising Finland Awakes as Finlandia, its very title aimed at international recognition for a country known to every Finn as Suomi. Released in 1900, the work swept the musical world, and its popularity remains undiminished, with the central hymn-like tune widely seen as Finland's unofficial national anthem. Jan Sibelius. Johann Sibelius was born in the town of Hämeenlinna in 1865. At first, he wanted to be a virtuoso violinist, but his student years in Helsinki, Berlin, and Vienna led him to concentrate on composing. In 1892, after the success of his choral symphony Kalervo, he married Aino Jarnefelt, with whom he went on to have 6 daughters. Further success, including the symphonic poem called the Swan of Tuonela of 1895, and then the first of 7 symphonies, spread his name abroad. The onset of throat cancer in 1908, though successfully treated, brought a darker mood that influenced the austere Symphony No. 4. In the 30 years before his death, in 1957, troubled by self-criticism, alcoholism, and the pressures of fame, Sibelius released few works. Other key works: 1892 Kalervo, 1902 Symphony No. 2, 1924 Symphony No. 7, 1926 Tapiola. See also, The Bartered Bride Pictures at an exhibition Pierre Jean Dvorak's Symphony No. 9 Appalachian Spring. In context. Focus. Nationalism in Spanish music before 1874. Francisco Asenjo Barbieri's El Barbarillo de Lavapiés is his most successful zarzuela, a form he played a key role in reviving. 1890. Felipe Pedrol publishes Por Nuestra Música, in which he explores Spain's musical heritage. After 1915. Manuel de Falla's Noches en los Jardines de España mingles French modernism with inspiration from Spanish folk music. 1939. Joaquim Rodrigo's Concierto de Aranjuez evokes the history of the former royal summer palace of Aranjuez. The Piano Suite Iberia by Isaac Albeniz is a collection of 12 solo pieces, published in 4 quadernos. Influenced by his friend Claude Debussy and the Impressionist art movement, Albeniz called these solo pieces impressions. Each seeks to evoke a different place or aspect of life in Spain. The pieces in the last 2 quadernos are challenging to play, inspired by the virtuoso skills of Catalan pianist Joaquim Malats, for whom Albeniz wrote them. Nearly all of the pieces in Iberia are inspired by Andalusia, southern Spain, reflecting Albaniz's great love of the region. The single exception is Lavapiés, which echoes the joyful buzz of the Jewish quarter of Madrid. Historical influences. In the mid-19th century, Spanish music came alive after centuries of domination by foreign sounds. Romantic nationalism swept across Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. In Spain, this gave rise to figures such as Francisco Asenjo Barbieri, a composer and critic who helped to revive the native opera tradition, the zarzuela. Catalan composer Felipe Pedrol also renewed interest in Spain's musical heritage, both in classical and folk and dance music. Inspired by Pedrol, Albeniz and his contemporaries drew on the rhythms of Spanish dances, such as the Northern Jota and the Fandango and Zapateado from the south, as well as Arabic-inspired melodies that evoked Spain's history as Al-Andalus, a Muslim land. The reincorporation of Spain into the European musical world. Joaquim Rodrigo. Virtuoso pianist. See also, The Bartered Bride Pictures at an exhibition Finlandia El Sombrero de Tres Picos Appalachian Spring. In context. Focus. 20th century Spanish music before 1897. Ruperto Chapi's La Revoltosa is one of the most popular zarzuelas of the decades before World War I. 1911. In Barcelona, Enrique Granados premieres the first part of his Piano Suite Goyescas, inspired by the paintings of Francisco Goya. After 1920. Igor Stravinsky's ballet Pulcinella is premiered in Paris by Diaghilev's Ballets Russes, choreographed by Massin, with sets by Picasso. 1961. Catalan musician Eduard Toldrà conducts a concert version of de Falla's unfinished work Atlantida at the Liceu in Barcelona. The ballet El Sombrero de Tres Picos, with music by the composer Manuel de Falla, was first performed by Sergei Diaghilev's Ballets Russes in London's Alhambra Theatre. Based on a novella by Pedro Antonio de Alarcón, it is a comedy about the magistrate of a small Andalusian town, who falls in love with the wife of the local miller. The ballet was choreographed by the Russian Leonid Massin, who also danced the part of the miller, with sets and costumes by Pablo Picasso. Falla grew up in the port city of Cádiz in Spain's far south, but studied at the Madrid Conservatory where, like many composers of his generation, he was influenced by Felipe Pedrol's explorations of the country's traditional music. Falla made his name with an opera, La Vida Breve, inspired by the Cante Jondo of his native Andalusia. In 1917, Falla and the impresarios Maria and Gregorio Martinez Sierra created an early, shorter version of El Sombrero de Tres Picos. Its success in Madrid brought it to the attention of Sergei Diaghilev, who then commissioned de Falla to compose the music for an expanded version with full orchestra. Like La Vida Breve, it uses Andalusian melodies and also contains Cante Jondo songs. Manuel de Falla composes at the piano in this 1925 portrait by Daniel Bosques Diaz, who painted the most famous and influential Spanish figures of his time. See also, the Bartered Bride Pictures at an exhibition Finlandia Iberia Appalachian Spring. Introduction. As the 19th century drew to a close, composers began to realize that they were facing a crisis point. Wagner had undermined tonality, the system of major and minor keys that had been the cornerstone of Western music, and introduced a style that some found over-emotional and lacking in clarity. The new generation reacted against Wagner's music in various ways, attempting to find a new musical language that better expressed modern times. As a result, the first half of the new century was characterized by various isms: Impressionism, Expressionism, Atonalism, Serialism, Neoclassicism, and more. There was one composer, however, who defied such classification, Erik Satie. He adopted a dry and witty style, with peculiarly static piano pieces that harked back to medieval and ancient music and at the same time made reference to popular Parisian café music. French developments. Satie's lightness of touch was also noticeable in the music of his contemporary, Claude Debussy. Yet Debussy chose a different way of creating a new musical language. Rather than reacting against the lack of clarity that came with a weakened tonality, he embraced it, using exotic harmonies as an impressionist artist uses different shades of color. Although he disliked the term, he was a pioneer of musical impressionism, which was further refined by Maurice Ravel and influenced the strikingly colorful compositions of Olivier Messiaen. After World War I, a group of young French composers known as Les Six picked up on the simplicity and wit of Satie's music. Poulenc, in particular, cultivated an urbane style, unashamedly classical in its tonality, setting the style for neoclassicism, which was especially strong in France. 12-tone serialism. Meanwhile, in turn-of-the-century Vienna, Arnold Schoenberg struggled to come to terms with the implications of the breakdown of tonality. After some early works in the late Romantic style, he stretched tonality to its limits and beyond, creating a violently expressionistic style that was completely atonal, without reference to any key. The difficulty of creating a cohesive structure led him to develop a system of composing in which, instead of having a home key, all 12 notes of the chromatic scale are given equal importance and arranged in a series. This 12-tone serialism became the compositional method of choice not only for Schoenberg but also for his students Alban Berg and Anton Webern. Shock of the new. In addition to these influential French and Viennese composers, there was a highly significant Russian composer, Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky made his name writing ballet music in the style of the Russian nationalist composers, but in 1913, he shocked audiences with his discordant portrayal of Russian folklore in Le Sacre du Printemps. The music was both primitive and ultramodern, and a world away from the romantic conception of folk-inspired orchestral music. Russian modernism was short-lived. After the revolutions of 1917, the Soviet authorities decried anything that smacked of elitism. Stravinsky, like several other Russian composers, spent the rest of his life abroad. Nationalism was far from dead, however, as the late works of Jean Sibelius and Leos Janáček show. It had also taken root in England, thanks to composers such as Ralph Vaughan Williams, who toured the country collecting folk tunes. The distinctive nuances of English folk music shaped the styles of Benjamin Britten and Michael Tippett in the next generation. Another collector of folk music was Bela Bartok, who, like Stravinsky, did not integrate the songs and dances of his native Hungary into an existing style but used them to create a new, modernist style. Schoenberg, Stravinsky, and Bartok all spent their final years in the U.S., which had become a center for new music. In the first half of the 20th century, it had given birth to ragtime and jazz and popular tunes by masters of the genre such as George Gershwin. It had also seen a very American tradition of experimentalism emerge, starting with Charles Ives, and attracting émigrés such as Edgar Varese, which would come to shape the course of musical development into the 21st century. In context. Focus Impressionism. Before 1891, Gabriel Fauré Cinq Melodies de Venise uses subtle, elusive harmonic progressions, similar to the Impressionist style. 1882, 1892 Ernest Chausson's poem De l'amour et de la mer contains passages and chord progressions which more vividly prefigure the harmonic language of Debussy's prelude. After 1912 in the ballet Daphnis et Chloe, Maurice Ravel uses fast-moving dots of sound, the musical equivalent of a pointillist painting. 1928-1929 the young Olivier Messiaen composes his Preludes, a collection of pieces heavily influenced by Debussy. Composed between 1891-1894, and based on the poem by Stéphane Mallarmé, Claude Debussy's first published orchestral work Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faun has since been hailed as the first significant Impressionist musical work. Later the composer Pierre Boulez even claimed that the work marked the very beginning of modern music. Debussy's musical language was an ideal counterpart to Mallarmé's symbolist poetry. The composer described the work as the general impression of the poem. It follows the ascending shape of the poem, as well as the scenery so marvelously described in the text. In the poem, a faun awakens from an afternoon nap, recalling a moment of arousal at the sight of a pair of water nymphs. The faun tries to embrace the nymphs, but they disappear into nothingness. Mallarmé's poem is evocative, yet fundamentally ambiguous, focusing on the deep sensuality of the moment. Debussy's interpretation of the poem sought to replicate this sensuality in an almost subversive upheaval of musical language. Its use of timbres seemed essentially new, of exceptional delicacy and assurance in touch. Pierre Boulez. Debussy and Wagner. This subversion is evident in Debussy's unmistakable references to the prelude from Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. That prelude opens with a yearning cello line followed by a half-diminished chord. Debussy's prelude also begins with a single line, a characterful flute flourish, before landing on a half-diminished chord. Wagner's Tristan chord then begins a chromatic progression ending in an unresolved imperfect cadence. Debussy's chord, however, shimmering amidst a harp glissando, dissolves into a seemingly unrelated dominant seventh, colored by the horns with a major ninth and sharpened 11th. Unlike Wagner, Debussy's work contains little tension, each chord is to be appreciated for the sensuality of its sound. The similarities to Wagner's work make Debussy's subversions all the more obvious. Like Wagner, Debussy also states his opening melody twice more, each time over increasingly lush harmony. This establishes E major as the tonic key of the piece, but the ambiguity of the chords used up to this point, which do not point clearly to a single key, means that the arrival at E major goes all but unnoticed in the moment. Despite this seeming ambiguity, under the surface, Debussy follows a fairly traditional tonal structure that stops the piece from sounding incoherent. 9 bars after the arrival of the tonic key, Debussy even quotes Wagner's Desire motif in the clarinet, getting as far as the third note, which he distinctively accompanies with Wagner's own dominant seventh harmony so it is unmistakable. Debussy strips the chord of Wagner's context, making it sound not tersely dissonant but lushly exotic. Turning the unfinished motif back and forth in descending and ascending chromatic scales, Debussy makes Wagner's profound utterance into his own plaything. The Greek god Pan pursues the nymph Syrinx in François Boucher's work. The amorous faun Pan featured in many of Debussy's works, including La Flûte de Pan and Syrinx. Claude Debussy. Born in a Parisian suburb to a shop owner and his wife, in 1862, Debussy began music lessons at the age of 7, and at 10 he embarked on a decade of study at the Paris Conservatoire. By 1890, he had composed more than 50 songs, but fewer larger-scale pieces, of which many were not published and some never completed. In the 1890s, he established the Impressionist style for which he is best remembered. His string quartet demonstrated many of the traits that were established in the Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faun, the culmination of which were his symphonic masterwork La Mer and his only published opera, Pelléas et Mélisande. In his later career, he focused on smaller-scale forms, composing many of his best-known piano works, including L'Île Joyeuse and his 2 books of preludes. Debussy died in Paris in 1918. Other key works 1902 Pelléas et Mélisande, 1903 Estampes, 1903, 1905 La Mer. The Afternoon of a Faun was adapted into a ballet by Vaslav Nijinsky in his first choreography for the ballets Russes. It premiered at the Théâtre du Châtelet in Paris in May 1912. Technical experiments. The prelude is notable for its use of Debussian added note chords. While dominant sevenths, ninths, 11 ths, or 13 ths are easy to find in the works of Wagner and Liszt, Debussy strips them of any expectation that, for example, a dominant chord must always resolve to its tonic. Rather than working toward resolution, Debussy progresses chromatically in unexpected directions. Often, chords are joined to each other by one or two common pitches or by subtle semitonal shifts. Debussy manipulates his audience's listening experience by subverting their expectations of what will come next. Unusual harmonies catch our attention, and we listen closely to their color and effect, hence, the reason why this sort of harmony is often called coloristic. The pulse of the prelude is slow beneath the surface filigree. While mostly in triple meter, some of the passages are in duple time, which contain bars of 2 or 4 beats. Likewise, the subdivision of the beats varies between compound time and simple. Triple and duple rhythms sometimes coexist. In the middle section, the accompaniment plays triplet cross rhythms against the duple melody, moving attention away from any regularity of pulse toward the music's rich textural fabric. While Impressionist music is sometimes considered less technical than other genres, Debussy's experimentation with rhythmic techniques shows that atmosphere and technicality can coexist. Sascha Waltz and Guests, a German dance troupe, reinterprets Lapper's Midi d'un Faun as a brightly colored and provocative beach scene at Sadler's Wells Theatre, London, in 2015. The original orchestra for Debussy's symphonic poem consisted of woodwinds, strings, harp, and horns, together creating a delicate, sensuous sound world. Staging the piece. Debussy's orchestra is moderately sized. Its only brass instruments are 4 horns, and only 2 percussion antique cymbals color the latter part of the piece with their delicate, bell-like tone. The orchestra does, however, have 2 harps, which help to create a more luxuriant sound. Long sections use divisé in the strings, sometimes playing sur la touche, over the fingerboard, where the tone is more mellow. Debussy's work premiered in Paris in December 1894, and Stéphane Mallarmé was invited to hear it. While he had initially opposed the composition of music based on his poem, Mallarmé came out full of praise, writing to Debussy that it went further in nostalgia and light, with finesse, uneasiness, and richness than his own work. I wasn't expecting anything like that. The music prolongs the emotion of my poem and conjures up the scenery more vividly than any color. Stéphane Mallarmé. Debussy and Impressionism. The word Impressionism is controversial when applied to music. Debussy himself, its most iconic exponent, railed against it. "I'm attempting something different," he wrote in 1908, "Imbeciles call Impressionism just about the least appropriate term possible." Despite this, Debussy's work is as much a musical equivalent to Monet as to Mallarmé. His tonally ambiguous harmonies could lead to numerous possible progressions, putting the focus on the sensual effect of each chord, while obscuring its role in the structure that underpins the piece, just as Monet's focus on colors and estual of lines communicates more about the sense than about the details of his subject. Both Debussy and Monet have been called anti-realist, but for Debussy, appealing to the very senses by which music is heard, was more real than realism. See also, the Ringcycle das Lied von der Erde Parade Quartet for the End of Time. In context. Focus. Female composers before 1644. The Venetian composer and singer Barbara Strozzi publishes her first book of madrigals. 1850. In France, the premier success of Louise Ferenc's Nanette for wind and strings allows her to negotiate equal pay as professor of piano at the Paris Conservatoire. After 1913, French composer Lily Boulanger is the first woman to receive the Prix de Rome for her cantata Faust et Helene. 2000, Finnish composer Kaija Saariaho premieres her 5-act opera L'Amour de Loin, based on the 12th century troubadour Joffre Rudel, at the Salzburg Festival. Women were writing opera from the form's first days. The earliest known opera by a woman, La Liberazione di Ruggiero dall'Isola di Alcina, by Francesca Caccini, was first performed in Caccini's native city of Florence in 1625. For Ethel Smith, however, writing a three-act grand opera, serious in theme, with no spoken dialogue, at the turn of the 20th century was an ambitious undertaking, both because she was female and also because she was English, British opera having been almost extinct since Henry Purcell. Life beyond the piano. For much of the 19th century, female composers were associated with piano and chamber music suited to the domestic sphere. Composers such as Louise Reichardt, Clara Schumann, and Fanny Mendelssohn were known for art songs, or lieder. Toward the end of the century, female composers began to spread their wings. Cécile Chaminade and Augusta Holmes, both French and near contemporaries of Smith, wrote major orchestral works, as did Amy Beach, who was the first American woman to write a symphony, the Gaelic Symphony. Some women also wrote opera. 30 years older than Smith, the French aristocrat Marie de Granvelle was a prolific composer whose works included a symphony, an oratorio, and 7 operas, the last of which, Mazeppa, based on a poem by Byron, was staged with some success in Bordeaux in 1892. 3 years later, Augusta Holmes's third and final opera, La Montagne Noire, was produced at the Paris Opera. Smith was in the French capital at the time and saw the work. In common with many others, she was disappointed by the opera but sympathized with the composer, writing later, knowing what I do about the difficulties of opera composers, especially plus the handicap of sex, the astonishing fact about it was that it existed at all. By then Smith had embarked on her own career as an opera composer. Crucial encouragement had come from the German conductor and Wagner champion Hermann Levi, a friend for whom Smith had played on the piano one of her earlier choral works, Mass in D. Impressed by the drama of the music, Levi told her, "You must at once sit down and write an opera." Taking up the challenge, in 1894 Smith completed her first opera, a comedy called Fantasio, staged in Weimar in 1898. Her second, Der Wald, was produced in Berlin and London in 1902 and a year later at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, the first opera by a woman to be performed there. By the time Smith wrote The Wreckers, her third opera, she was winning wide recognition, though it was still difficult to get the work staged in her own country. For the British, opera was chiefly an upper-class entertainment put on by foreigners in London during the social season. When Smith first submitted The Wreckers to the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, the managing committee told her, to announce a new work by a new composer is to secure an absolutely empty house, and in future no opera will be produced here that has not established its success abroad. The audience prepared to leave after watching an opera at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, London, in 1910, the year The Wreckers had its first performance at the venue. "I feel awfully full of power, deadly sure of what I am doing. I love to see how I am getting to orchestrate better and better." Ethel Smith. Letter to librettist Henry Brewster. A Cornish Tale. Completed in 1904 and first performed 2 years later in Leipzig, The Wreckers is set in a remote village on the coast of Cornwall in the late 18th century. The villagers are wreckers, who make their living by luring ships onto the rocky shore and plundering them. The drama of the opera centers on 2 lovers, Thyrza and Mark, who are opposed to this thievery. Thyrza is the young wife of Pascoe, leader of the wreckers but also the village preacher, a dual role not at all incongruous to most of the villagers, who see no contradiction between their looting and their faith. Mark has been secretly lighting beacons to warn ships off the rocks. When the villagers discover that a night of plundering has been sabotaged by Mark and Thyrza, they condemn them to death as adulterers and traitors, imprisoning them in a sea cave that fills with water at high tide. As the waves rise, the lovers sing their final duet, a bridal song, "Our last ecstasy, thy embrace, O sea." 2 composer sisters, Nadia and Lily Boulanger, posed together in 1913. Nadia was also an influential teacher, whose students included Aaron Copland and Philip Glass. Ethel Smith. The daughter of a French mother and a British Major General, Ethel Smith was born in the English county of Kent in 1858. At the age of 19, she went to Germany to study music at Leipzig Conservatory, where her fellow students included Grieg, Dvorak, and Tchaikovsky. Back in England, she started to win recognition for musical composition in the 1890s, championed by such diverse figures as the exiled French Empress Eugenie and the playwright George Bernard Shaw. In 1910, Smith met the women's suffrage campaigner Emmeline Pankhurst and devoted the next 2 years to the suffragette cause. In later years, she was hampered by deafness and so turned to writing instead of music. She was made a Dame of the British Empire in 1922 and died in 1944. Other key works: 1891 Mass and D. 1894 Fantasio. 1914 The Boatswain's Mate. 1924 Entente Cordiale. Records seize cargo from a ship that has foundered on the Cornish coast, and an etching from the 1822 book Scenes in England by the Reverend Isaac Taylor. Between whiles I would lie on the cliffs, buried in soft pink thrift, listening to the boom of the great Atlantic waves against those cruel rocks, and the wild treble cries of the seagulls. Ethel Smith. Bringing the opera to life. Smith's inspiration for the opera had been a walking holiday in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. Here, she had heard tales of the wreckers of old and of the religious revival in 18th-century Cornwall led by the founder of the Methodists, John Wesley. A sea cave called Piper's Hole in the Isles of Scilly had given her the idea for the cave in which the lovers Thirza and Mark meet their death. Her librettist, as with her 2 previous operas, was an old friend, Henry Brewster. The son of a Bostonian father and English mother, Brewster had been raised in France and was more at ease writing in French than in English, so they decided that the libretto would be in French, which Smith also spoke and wrote fluently. The libretto was composed through correspondence between Brewster in Rome and Smith in Surrey. The music, meanwhile, was firmly rooted in the German tradition. Trained in Leipzig, as a composer, Smith belonged to a lineage that passed from Beethoven through Brahms, whom Smith, throughout her life an avid social networker, had known in Leipzig, to Mahler, just 2 years her junior. With such a clear Germanic background, the influence of Wagner was inescapable, despite Smith once protesting, "I never was, nor am I now, a Wagnerite in the extreme sense of the word." The record shows clear Wagnerian traces, such as the rich orchestration, evoking the coast and seascapes of Cornwall, and the use of leitmotifs, musical themes associated with particular individuals and emotions. At the same time, the drama has a marked British character in its setting and themes. The hymns and other choruses sung by the villagers, for instance, bear the clear imprint of the English oratorio tradition. Derivative though the music is in many ways, Smith had nonetheless achieved her objective with the Wreckers. She had written a viable British opera that could, for the first time, bear comparison with the works of the major continental opera composers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Although imperfectly worked out, the basic drama of the opera is compelling with strong characters and situations. It takes on serious themes of greed, love, moral conflict, and religious fanaticism. At its best, as in the prelude to the second act, On the Cliffs of Cornwall, the music is colorful and atmospheric. Although indebted to Wagner's Siegfried, the second act duets between the lovers Thirza and Mark, torn between passion and moral responsibility, strike a new, raw note in British operatic music. The whole English attitude toward women in fields of art is ludicrous. There is no sex in art. How you play the violin, paint, or compose is what matters. Ethel Smith. The premiere. Her work completed, it then took Smith 2 years to get the Wreckers staged. The premiere, when it eventually came, was in Leipzig's Neues Theater, Brewster's libretto having been translated into German. To Smith's fury, the director had made cuts to the third act, although the first night audience greeted the mutilated version with thunderous applause. After the director refused to reinstate his cuts for subsequent performances, an enraged Smith stormed into the theater early the next morning and removed all the scores she could find in the orchestra pit. There would be no more performances of the Wreckers in Leipzig. Smith then caught a train to Prague, where another performance was scheduled. This proved an even greater disaster, since the orchestra had not rehearsed properly, leading to damning reviews in the local press. The composer had better luck at the next location, Vienna, where Mahler was director of the opera house. He expressed an interest in seeing Smith, but the person she actually met was his second-in-command, the conductor Bruno Walter. He was impressed but could not promise a production. Back in London, Smith's experiences were similarly checkered. In 1908, a concert version of the first two acts was well received by many critics but overshadowed by personal sadness. Brewster, who was in the final stages of liver cancer, had traveled from Rome for the performance. He died less than a month later. The next year, the Wreckers, now translated by Smith into English, was successfully staged at His Majesty's Theatre, London, conducted by the young Thomas Beecham. The conductor also included it in